Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Karen Ryle and I teach in the writing program here at Penn. And I'm really excited for this event today. I hope you all have your lunches out in front of you. If we were at Kelly Writer's house, we would be serving you lunch, but now we can just wish you a happy lunch. I'm so excited to begin this program today. I'm going to start by introducing Libby. Libby Copeland is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, The New York Times, The New Republic, Esquire.com, and The Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family: How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, "Before you spit in that vial, read this book." The Washington Post says, "The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both?" I personally feel lucky to have had Libby as a student when she was a sophomore here at Penn in 1996 in a wonderful and memorable class. Libby is a naturally gifted writer with an inquisitive, open mind and a strong sense of ethics. I've been following her career for over 20 years and have been so excited about this book. Profound culture and societal shifts often arise offstage, unnoticed at first, until we pause to realize that everything we once took for granted has changed. The Lost Family is an undeniably important achievement, a must-read that shines a light on an evolving and complex set of new questions with implications for every one of us, our children, and the future of human civilization. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm so excited to be here with you. And as we've spoken about, I remember your class so vividly and with such warmth because it was a wonderful, wonderful writing class that really opened me up in so many ways. So thank you. It's a treat to be here. We were just talking and we thought that I would read a little short section from The Lost Family, and just for a little bit of context. So the book is about recreational DNA testing. What is recreational DNA testing? It's where you test to find out, how Irish you are, how Nigerian you are, how Korean you are, how Swedish you are, and you get that little ethnicity pie chart. And some people know this and some people don't, but you also get lists of genetic relatives who are also in the database. And sometimes you get profound surprises that really rework and upend and shift how people think about themselves, their relationships with their families, their place on this earth, and what they think they know about the past and about truth. And these revelations can be really disorienting and jarring and sometimes quite beautiful. And so for the book, I tell a lot of these stories because intimate stories of basically ordinary people experiencing extraordinary things are like the thing I love to write about more than anything. So in the book, one of the many stories I tell is the tale of this guy named Rosario Castronovo, who believes himself to be Italian because his mother told him that they were Sicilian, and has always been grasping at that Sicilian identity, always converting to Catholicism as an adult, changing his name to Rosario Castronovo from his previous name, which was not very Italian sounding, proposing to an Italian-American woman, learning to sing opera. I mean, this guy was so attached to his Italian roots. And come to find out when he did DNA testing and genealogical research that he is not one whit Italian. In fact, what he is he has significant sub-Saharan African ancestry. And I encountered a number of people as I was reporting the book whose families had hid their African ancestry from them, or there was a process of intergenerational forgetting, or purposeful not speaking of. And in Rosario's case, his mother hid it from him because she didn't want him to experience the profound discrimination that she had experienced as a biracial child growing up in the middle of the 20th century in white rural Vermont. So I talked to Rosario over many months and years at this point, and sort of followed him on his journey, which is absolutely fascinating. I'll just read you a short section from towards the end of the book, when we've been sitting with Rosario for a little while. And he has this to say about discovering that he isn't who we thought, and sort of what that means for his understanding of himself, his family, and the history of America. Rosario struggles with how to think about himself and how to present himself to the world. It's kind of weird for a guy who presents as white to say, "I'm Black," Rosario said. "I'm still getting used to it." Could he even claim Blackness, he wondered, without that lived experience and without any of the implications of what it means to be perceived as a Black man in contemporary America? "I'll never know what it's like to be pulled over by a police officer and fear for my life," he said. "Can I call myself Black and never have to experience it? It almost seems unfair, or like I'm pandering." And yet, his mother's elderly cousin, who is more fair-skinned than he, and according to her DNA results, has less African ancestry than his mother, is quite clear in her identity as a Black woman. "It's a social construct," Rosario told me. "I raised myself as an Italian man. I immersed myself in Italian culture. What do I do now?" We were talking on Independence Day, and Rosario told me that the more history he learned about his Black family, about the lives of Black people in Vermont and in the rest of America, the more he wondered what he should be celebrating on this day, and if he should be celebrating at all. "I have learned more about African American history in this country, and the more granular you get, the more bitter you become," he said. "I never got to know my people." And yet, genetic genealogy and DNA testing had also given him an opportunity to know about what had been hidden, to wrestle with his mother's pain, with his grandparents' sacrifices, and with the wrongs done to his family. DNA testing had given back to him and to his mother a little of what was stolen by the past. That's a little section on one of the fascinating subjects that I got to interview for this book.
Thank you so much. That was a beautiful example, both of one of the very moving human interest stories that you intersperse throughout this book, and also gorgeously written. And I have to say, as someone who focuses so much on the technique of writing in my classes, it's just your book is such a pleasure to read. Before we start our conversation, I want to just remind the audience that you can write any questions that you have into the YouTube chat, and the Kelly Writers House staff is going to pass them to us here on Zoom, which is how we're conducting the conversation. Also, they're going to share a link in the chat on YouTube for bookshop.org, which is a really great way to purchase books in a way that benefits both the organization and the press. So it's a great alternative to Amazon or one of the other sort of big box ways of ordering a book. So they'll be putting that link occasionally into the chat, so you can click on it and get the book really quickly. So I would love to talk about process. I guess one of the things that impressed me so much about your book is how you overcame this sort of challenge of synthesizing so much data and just information for non-expert readers in areas of science and technology, as well as philosophy and ethics and sociology and business history and just business in general, and doing it in a way that was also entertaining, because I'm probably your average reader. I know a little bit about DNA testing and genetics, but really not that much. And I had to follow all of it, and I could. So you did it in a way that was just I'm just so impressed with how well you did that. And also, you sort of threaded a lovely sort of interesting mystery through the book, which kept it's kind of a page turner that also is very, very instructive. And I'm wondering, how did you do that in under 300 pages?
Yeah, it was definitely a challenge. And I think I had no idea what I was biting off at the very beginning. I had this idea that if I could come up with a really compelling narrative that had lots of like plot twists and turns, that I could like basically just like pick the reader up by the ankles and drag her through the book, right? And that she would go along with whatever else. And I had this idea that I could take this narrative. I mean, I can't claim credit for the central narrative being as astonishing as it is, right? It's so good, it's so perfect, because it's the story of a woman who tests at the very beginning of the DNA testing age, autosomal DNA testing, which is the type of DNA testing we're talking about, which gives you your ethnicity estimate and your list of genetic relatives along both sides. That had just kind of come onto the scene in 2012 when she tested. So, you know, she tests, she finds a mystery, and she explores all the theories that would explain her unexpected ancestry. Like Rosario, she gets very unexpected results. She is expecting to be entirely Irish American. She turns out to be half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And so she goes through the theories that anyone would go through and immediately thinks, okay, maybe I'm not, you know, genetically related to my dad, which is an experience that is so common at this point among people who do DNA testing, that it is known by its own acronym, which is NPE, for non-paternity event or not parent expected. And if you go on any of these Facebook groups that cater to people who have genetic surprises that they didn't quite think they were going to get when they just paid $99 and spit into a vial, you will see they are just lousy with I'm an NPE, I just found out I'm an NPE, et cetera, et cetera. So the woman who's the central character, Alice, she explores the possibility she's an NPE and she's not. And she goes through all the kind of possibilities of things that could explain it, donor conception, adoption, hidden genetic ancestry. It's none of those things. And so why Alice's story matters, it's kind of a shocking and stunning whodunit, right? It's like an existential whodunit. But in her story, it encapsulates all these other scenarios, because every time she explores the theory, it gives you the opportunity, or gave me the opportunity to show you what it looks like. What does it look like to experience an NPE, and multiple different accounts of that from different sides. So the fact that she tests so early gives me an opportunity to give a kind of a chronological story of the industry. The fact that she explores all these theories, none of which turn out to be true, give me an opportunity to tell you different accounts of DNA testing surprises and the very basic, essential human questions that those experiences raise. Because I think what I wanted to do most of all, I obviously give you the history of the industry, and I gave a lot of science and stuff, and not being a scientist and not having a biology degree meant I had to dumb it down for myself to understand it. So I had to keep repeating it to scientists and saying, I think I understand it. Is this what you mean? And they kept, no, not exactly. And they would correct, and I would go back and forth and check it like that. And I had a geneticist read the book, like just to fact check it. I had a genetic counselor read portions of the book. I had every scientist I interviewed, I would basically go back to them and say, like, do I have this right? Right? This is what I think you said. Do I have this right? And it would be these lengthy back and forth, like emails, this slightly. So anyway, the science was important to get right. And again, to like make it accessible. So in order for me to understand it, I had to really bite size it. And then I felt like by the time I got to the point where I got it, I could then translate it for other people who also don't have PhDs in genetics. But the most of all thing that I was trying to accomplish was this question that is not, does not require an advanced degree to examine, which is this question of selfhood. Right. And it's the literally hundreds of people that I've talked to or emailed with over the last 3 years for this book. They are all asking some version of that question of like, who am I now and who would I have been if I'd known? So there was some, bioethics conversations I was having, and conversations with, people who are steeped in philosophy, sociology, and psychology. But at the end of the day, these are questions that are also like very relatable to all of us, whether we've had a DNA test and gotten a surprise, or whether we've never even heard of DNA testing. There's only a handful of people left who don't, but know what it is, but they exist. And, you know, and that is questions we've all like thought about, right? Like who am I? And how much did my family form me? And how much would I have been still myself if I had been raised by wolves? You know, and there's always people with a fantasy that they're not actually related to their family. And those people then also wonder, like, why do I have this sense of non-belonging? You know, there's so many sort of essential human experiences, like what is ethnicity? Is it like experience, or is it DNA? Should your DNA even get to tell you what you are? Or is it more a facet of everything you experienced you know, through your childhood, which is something Rosario kind of struggles with. So yeah, I mean, process-wise, it was challenging for sure. And as I think Karen and I we spoke over the phone. And as I told you, like I handed in my first draft of the book, and it was like really long. It was 135,000 words. And my editor said, great. And now you just need to cut 35,000 words. And I mean, like, I've never written 35,000 words to cut before. Like, it was like, you know, now you just need to slice your arm open. Okay. But the magic of slicing my arm open was that it forced me to think about my audience and to realize I have a newspaper background. So sometimes when you're reporting for newspaper, you can be like a little bit overly dutiful in terms of like including all sides and all perspectives, and like, but on the other hand, this one thing happened on September 18th, but yes, but no, but this person says this. And what I was forced to do for the book was think more in terms of narrative, right? And storytelling, without eliding, without skipping over, you know, pertinent facts. I realized there were ways to kind of streamline, and I really was forced to streamline because I needed to be able to drag the reader by her ankles through, and I didn't want her to get lost or stuck or bored at any point.
I always tell my students that editors will force you to cut, and there is a point of diminishing returns, of course, but almost every piece is better for being cut. And I have to say, like, your book is an incredible accomplishment, because I felt like on many levels my mind was opened up to questions, and on other levels I learned a lot, and some of it kind of went right through me, like all the DNA science. I have to admit, I was on the page with you and I probably couldn't recite it right now, but I know I couldn't, but you know, it's just an amazing accomplishment, and I have to say that's wonderful. I also wanted to I guess it's kind of a half of a question and half a point. So Alice is this fascinating character, and also there's a warmth that we feel towards her that is your warmth, because you obviously really like her, and she's this woman in her mid-70s, maybe she's a little older now, and she lives on the West Coast, and she's very tiny, as you point out, and that has to do, and all that factors into the mystery. So I guess one of my questions is, how did you find her? I remember when you were starting researching the article that preceded this book, you did put out a call on Facebook for people who had unusual results with DNA testing. So I'm wondering if that's where that came from. And then the other thing, you make this very interesting point at the end of the book, which has to do with sort of the existence of the book itself, which is that Alice, who's a very technologically minded, smart, like methodical person, started her quest in 2012, which was very early on. And she came up with some data points later, after she kind of already knew her answer, that came in 2017, that would have solved the mystery almost instantly for her, and she wouldn't have spent all these years sort of in an obsessional quest to get to the answer. And that's because the database is bigger now than it was, you know. So, you know, and I just wonder if you could just sort of comment on those two questions. And also, I just want to also say, like, what a great name, Alice, because when we did find the answer to her mystery, which I don't want to reveal because it's definitely worth going through reading the mystery, it becomes a very Alice in Wonderland type moment. My mind kept, you know, that emoji where the brain is exploding, my mind kept exploding when I was reading about it. So
yeah, and the first time I heard her story, my brain exploded, and I thought, oh, this is too good to be true. Mm-hmm. And I first heard about her because I called up a woman named CC Moore, who is a prominent genetic genealogist, even more prominent now. But she was still pretty well known, particularly within the community back when I first reached out to her, which was like early 2017. And she told me a bunch of stories of, I sort of said, I'm looking for some stories that would tell this greater story of this notion that you go into something that you think of as a form of entertainment. I mean, that's how DNA testing is marketed. If you see the Ancestry ads and the 23andMe ads, it's marketed as a form of entertainment. It's marketed as a gift, which is how I got my first kit. It's like the gift you get for the person in your life who already has everything. You buy it on sale for Thanksgiving or Father's Day, and it's only $59, so it's so low investment, and you purchase it for someone. And it's a low investment but high profundity experience for many people. And even people who don't get a surprise in terms of like, oh my gosh, my immediate family isn't what I thought, often find like their understanding and their awareness of their own families deepened. And that's what happened with my family. So anyway, to sort of to dial back, okay, so you asked me about Alice. I called Cece and was talking to her, and she was telling me different stories. And I imagined that this was originally going to be a newspaper article, and I thought that it was going to be like one of those trend stories where you tell like 3 or 4 different characters in the context. Like I had talked to my editor about it, and she was like, "Yeah, we'll probably tell a bunch of stories. Like they'll all kind of tell different experiences." And when Cece told me about this woman named Alice, I just thought, well, that could be the whole thing, right? But it won't check out. How could it possibly check out? It's too good. And I called Alice, and it was better. It was better because it was like, Cece had given me the thumbnail version, and Alice was giving me the twists and turns. And there was like multiple red herrings in the story, like ton of French level red herrings. Mm-hmm. And I was like, boom, and that first time I talked to her, we were on the phone for an hour and a half. I had been having like wrist issues. It was like, a type fest, galore. And, I got off the phone after an hour and a half. She hadn't even really taken me through all of it. And I was just like, wow, I'm tired. I can't believe it. And I started asking her for documents because I just wanted to sort of see, what I could see and see how the story checked. And she had saved everything. She had saved every email. She could screenshot it. She is a technology maven who's far better on the computer than me, saves everything, knows where everything is, and she could send me documentation of everything. And the more time I spent with her, the more I came to appreciate her mind. This was a woman who was working with mainframe computers in the 60s. She was rising in the technology world when there were many times when she was the only woman in the room or close to the only woman in the room. She was asking for raises when men were making more. She's worked with data processing. So she's somebody who knows like how to take a lot of data and organize it till it makes sense, which turned out to be precisely the skills that she needed. You could not plan it better, because what she wound up having to do was build a database of her own DNA and all of her siblings. And there's 7 Collins kids. They come from a large Irish Catholic family. So she had to build a database of all of their DNA and all of their their thousands of genetic relatives, which included over 300,000 like little data points of overlapping genetic segments. It's mind-blowing. And she can explain all of it. And then her humor. She's just like funny, but in this understated, dry way, and kind of unemotional for the most part, kind of just this great analytical brain. So she spent 2.5 years steeped in her own existential mystery before she was able to solve it. And yet, like you say, if she tested now, it would be a completely different experience. She would know the answer within weeks, if not sooner. And that is because when she tested the databases back in 2012, if you were to combine all the databases, it was at well less than 1 million. And now we have 35 million people in the databases, and the vast majority of them are American. So if you are looking for a genetic relative, let's say you heard a rumor that you have a half sister who was born before you were born, and maybe raised by that child's mother, and it's just sort of a family rumor. Like, there's a solid chance that if you test, she's going to be in there. If she's not going to be in there, maybe someone else is in there who can like illuminate her identity. And we are increasingly getting to the point where, regardless of whether you test, it kind of doesn't matter anymore, right? If there's a family secret in your family, a genetic secret, it's going to come out. It's a matter of if anymore. It's a matter of when. And if you are being sought by somebody because you helped conceive a child as a donor in the 1970s, right? Or maybe you conceived a child in high school and you didn't even know it. Your decision to test or not to test increasingly doesn't matter. Your second cousin tests.
I think that's one of the most important points that you make, because we've had a profound change in our society and we're not even really aware of it.
We're not.
So not just the people that you call seekers who are looking they want to know the mystery of where they came from, but it's people who might prefer privacy or who have no opinion about it whatsoever. Our privacy is gone now because of this. And so there's, I think you give a wonderfully balanced explanation of all that. Right.
Yeah, and it's not just the DNA testing that creates that perfect storm for the loss of privacy. It's that combined with the social media presence that we all have and the digital breadcrumbs that we all leave that make it so that, if you're seeking someone, you're going to be able to find someone. If you're genetically related to someone and you don't know their identity, you're going to be able to suss it out whether or not they're in a database.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have some questions coming in. I'm just going to read the first one to you. It's from Barbara Sheehan. And she asked, did you find that some people were disappointed to get expected results? I mean, people looking for surprises.
Yes. And I was. And I've heard that over and over. I got a 23andMe kit in late 2016. I tested in early 2017. And my results were kind of really pretty boring. And as I was reporting the book, I thought, oh, okay, but there is a blessing in boring, right? Because I was not suddenly forced into all this like grand reckoning that so many of the people that I interviewed experienced. But yes, I've heard that over and over from people where they'll say, yeah, I got what I expected, and it was so disappointing. Honestly, what that means is, like, if you get into genealogy, which a lot of people do through DNA testing, it means then you dig, because there's stories that are fascinating, right? But you got to dig a little, and sometimes you can find them through spotting a DNA cousin that you don't know the backstory of, and you start talking to that person, putting your heads together and understanding your family history a little bit better.
I have a quick question for you, because this occurred to me because you've done so much research into this topic. It sounds like you did the DNA testing before you started working on this. Am I correct?
It was contemporaneous. I got the gift beforehand, and then it was sitting on top of my microwave.
Okay.
Because I have little-ish kids. They were little then, now they're little-ish. And I was like, this is a rabbit hole I don't have time for. And then as I started reporting it out, I tested. Yeah.
So after you thought about all the sort of philosophical and sociological and maybe psychological ramifications, do you have any regrets that you did the test personally?
That's a really good question. I don't think I have regrets, because I feel like mostly what we got was like a fuller understanding of our family. And we wound up connecting with relatives in Sweden and actually going there and meeting them, and to be able to see my dad and his sister go to the place where their grandmother had grown up before she emigrated in the late 1800s was profound. I mean, they were able to see where their, like, the foundation of the house, the farmhouse where their grandmother had grown up. They were very close with her, and her church and her school, and touch a piece of furniture that had been in the family. Like that kind of access for many Americans is elusive.
Yeah. Right.
We leave the past behind. We may not even know our grandparent or great grandparents' ethnic background or culture. But sometimes I wonder, because there are questions that remain about, like, what's going to happen to this information down the line. So when I tested, and I've now tested in 3 companies, I spent a lot of time reading through these consent documents, which were 10,000 words often. And the consent and privacy. And I spent days steeped in them. And like, there was a moment when I thought I was going to get a law degree. And I was like, damn it. Like if only, because I could not understand them. I mean, there was one phrase in the ancestry document that was called personal information. You would think personal information would be easy to define, but it had a very long, complicated definition. And I had to keep like reading it and track. Okay, so what does this mean if personal information, and now they've got it, and they're saying they can release this as, it was very confusing. But I eventually got to the point where I was like, I feel reasonably okay about what they're going to do with this, right? And like that they're not sharing it with third parties for the most part, unless I'm consenting to research. And this feels okay to me. But then like, as I was reporting, I was also talking to people who were telling me, okay, but what happens, if one company, let's say some company comes along and buys one of these companies, and they have a different consent document. Like what's kind of governing their use of your data other than best business practices? And you may feel good about what their consent document says now, but what if they change the terms at some point, and which they have every right to do if you read the document? Or, but that seems unlikely, right? They want to maintain their good relationships with their customers. More likely 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, some company comes along and buys them. Mm-hmm. And does whatever they want with the information, and I perhaps don't have the capacity to revoke my permission anymore or delete my kit. So that is something I think about, but it is abstract and intangible compared to the very tangible kind of gift of access to the past that we got, and it's hard to manage those two things.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I wonder is that I think I mentioned in our conversation, my spouse and I tested in 2014, and it was on a lark because friends of ours had tested, and we found out very, like exactly what we already knew about ourselves. Although some surprises have appeared in the past year, which I won't talk about here. But I realized later that my children didn't consent to that. I have 4 kids, and yours didn't either. And part of me is thinking, should I go in and delete all this now while we still can? We only did it with one of the companies that our friends had done. So
yeah,
it's something to think about. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I just thought, since you've thought so much about this, you could tell me, but I don't know. So
that's a really good point. Yeah.
We have another question coming in. It's from David Marchino, and this is a process question. He says, what was the interview process like? The passage you read really, really emphasizes how sensitive this topic can be. How did you approach questioning folks while handling your interviewees with care?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm like somebody who's very like kid gloves, because I always assume, I think I'm a very sensitive person, so I always assume other people are as fragile as me, and actually usually they're not. So I go into everything, and it's a push-pull experience. I was a newspaper reporter for 11 years, and then since then I've been freelance, and like it's kind of exhausting because there's always this push-pull experience as a newspaper reporter where it's like, go for it, ask the questions. And then if you're somebody who happens to be like an introvert, which is like the stupidest, but apparently there are a lot of journalists who are introverts, I've heard. Well, I thought it was just me for a very long time. If you're someone who happens to be like an overly sensitive introvert, you're always like, oh, okay, I got to ask this question, but I hope this doesn't hurt your feelings. And like I said, generally it's more me than them. So the thing is, the people that I was talking to were disposed to tell their stories. They were people to whom something had happened that made them question often their genetic origins. And in many cases, they had reached out to me because I was writing this book. I had written an article for the Washington Post. I had put an email address at the bottom, inviting people. And then, then like the responses poured in to the point where like, there are some people I think I never replied to because I just was so completely underwater. So I would read their stories, and then I would call them up, and almost always they were more, invested, in telling me their story and being named and telling me all the details. And I was the one who was like, okay, we're going to talk about this, sensitive issue now. Okay, let's. And what I tried to do was just build trust and talk to them I gave them a lot of time. I thought that was the right thing to do. And my background as a reporter was always distance, objectivity and distance. And I found that this process was somewhat different, particularly with Alice and her family, but also with some of the folks that I talked to over and over again. I did find that I got drawn into their emotional stories, which is not to say that I wasn't also able to appreciate that there were people on the other sides of their stories who felt quite differently. But in their humanness, I would sometimes get drawn in, and I did find myself crying on occasion. So there's a woman who I write about in the book who discovers she's adopted at age 51 when she takes an ancestry test. She's adopted, and like her mother and her brothers never told her. And she literally just underwent a radical hysterectomy that quite possibly she would not have had to undergo if she had known that she wasn't genetically related to her parents. Okay, boom, right? And her mom's still alive and didn't tell her. And I could understand, she reaches out to her biological father's side and biological mother's side, and they are pretty much rejecting along both sides, because she is, the fact of her existence is problematic for both sides of the family. And I can understand that. And, I did do interviews with people sort of on the other sides of those journeys, and I can understand that. And I can understand that the questions it raises and the things that it brings back are often rooted in shame from, the 50s, the 60s. And they are things that, even though they're no longer cultural taboos, like being a unwed teenage mother, nowadays there's much less stigma to that. I mean, there's still some stigma, but it's not this thing we do not speak about. Even though we're in a different culture, like the taboos are somehow frozen in amber, right? And so there's shame. It doesn't go away just because the times have changed. That decision to keep a secret stays frozen as a secret, even like the times, even as the times change. So I could understand, as I did interviews with Linda and with other people, that the people on the other side, their reluctance to engage. But that didn't mean that when Linda was telling me her story, that I wasn't deeply moved by her suffering, because she wanted more than anything to be accepted, and she could not get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of very painful stories in the book, which certainly balance out the more sort of not joyful, but just sort of interesting and satisfying. Like Alice's story ends up being very satisfying, although there are questions, and we were talking about this, like I don't want to get into any particulars that would be spoilers, but there are some questions that are raised that if this were a novel, I would certainly write it in. There's things that are potentially like just very tragic, but we're not really sure. Yeah, I have a question about. So one of the things I thought was so well done in the book is that in addition to the customers who took DNA tests and had their lives upended, you also had to interview a lot of corporate executives and founders and people who had more of a sort of professional, some of them were scientists, but particularly the corporate people who appear in the book. And you've managed, against all odds, to sort of create them as like sort of almost rounded characters. They don't have the same degree of sort of coloring to them as the people that are, just sort of bearing their emotions. But these people are representing business interests. And how did that go? Like, was it difficult? Like, how did you draw these people out? Did you find that more of a challenge to kind of make them sort of appear more rounded on the page?
Yeah, so I think I have a tendency to overthink things, and the beauty of having to produce a book in a year. I mean, I all told, I wound up spending 3 years on this, but from the time that I sold the proposal, at which point I had done a great deal of work, to the time when I had to hand in the first draft was a year. And the beauty of that grueling deadline was that I didn't have time to think too much. And so I had to go with my gut. And there were opportunities I had to interview or pursue different kind of executive voices. And I just had a feeling that the guy that I wanted to go with was the right guy. And it was because when I had first talked to him back in 2017, when I was writing this Washington Post article, and I wound up, I don't even think I quoted him in there, but he was so candid with me. I was stunned. I was able to get him on the phone. Ann Wojcicki at 23andMe is not picking up the phone at headquarters. But this guy, whose name is Bennett Greenspan, who is the founder of Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest DNA testing company in the US. It was founded in 2000, DNA testing for ancestry purposes. So it was founded in 2000, and he's one of the 4 major databases, but he's the smallest. He just he was like, why don't you, you could come on down here and I could give you a tour of the lab. And at the time it was like, okay. And then, I started working on the book and I thought, gosh, this guy's pretty interesting. And he's invited me to come in, and that kind of level of, and he wound up being he was just this super chatty, garrulous, salesman who was a serial entrepreneur, who's always selling a product, who knows how to kind of charm people. And I wound up going down to Texas, and he toured me the lab, and he was interesting too, because he could be kind of prickly, which I didn't realize at first. And then I could see it, and then I could put it in, and I could layer that in. And in a way, it was an interesting process, because once I had done that and I had spent that time with him, and he had tons of stories, and he was such a character, as I was following the book, then his company did something very controversial, and they handled it pretty poorly. And I was able to go back to him because I had this relationship, and get him on the phone and get his version of things, which was totally undermined by a version that he gave, multiple versions that he gave other people. And he became so complicated, right? He became somebody who seemed one way. And then of course, as time goes on, turns out to be much more complicated, as many people are. And I thought that, and that worked out well for me. I mean, it was a pain in the butt, because I was comparing multiple statements that he'd given to different people with the version that he'd given me, but it was also very telling, because I think at the end of the day, when you are testing with a company like this, ultimately the person who's making your decisions about privacy, who is deciding what happens to your DNA, what they're going to do with it. Are they going to allow law enforcement to access it? All these things. What this man's story demonstrated is that it ultimately comes down to the company's decisions rather than yours, right? In the case of this company, Family Tree DNA, it came down to one man. And that is a very interesting thing to know, and an important thing to consider when you're testing is that, the regulation is limited, and that it is the companies themselves who are making many of these decisions about how robustly to protect your information.
That's very scary and fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Did you find that it was? Did you get any sort of negative pushback from any of the corporate interests that you were trying to connect with to make the book?
Not, maybe unbeknownst to me. I didn't get the negative pushback directly, because I was dealing with very professional PR people. But what I did find was that access could be a challenge. So, I juxtaposed the story of Family Tree DNA, which is the smallest of the major DNA databases, with Ancestry, which is the largest. Ancestry currently has 18 million people in its database, which is just, enormous. Family Tree DNA, I could fly down there. I met directly with the founder. They were in a nondescript brick building on, the side of a highway. I could walk around, I could tour the lab. I had to wear the little cap and the gown and everything. Ancestry was so buttoned up, gleaming headquarters, massive space that, accounts for, over 1,000 employees, clocks on the wall with, every time zone from every, office that they have. Just to get into the building, I had to sign a confidentiality agreement that I wouldn't talk about anything I saw inside, which I then had to get a an actual waiver from the PR person saying I could, because the whole reason I was there was that I was a journalist. And it was, it was like, it was so buttoned up. And it was so, such a challenging thing to report. So, I could definitely sense there that the kind of the corporate culture and how it trickles down and makes journalism or reporting on a particular company very, very challenging. But as far as negative feedback, no. I mean, maybe they hated it. They didn't tell me. That's okay.
Yeah. It's kind of one thing that keeps impressing me as I, have been reading the book and then sort of rereading it and thinking about it, is that you're bringing together a lot of threads that we're sort of talking about right now in our conversation, although it's distracted in 2020 in October. But, issues about privacy and issues about, just sort of how technology interfaces with our life. And you also brought in lots of layers, like different demographic issues for different demographics of people. For example, like, people who are descendants of former slaves and the Mormons and their vast repository of genealogical information that certainly well predates even any kind of DNA testing. And I almost felt that any one of these issues could have generated an entire book. And I'm picturing you for like the 3 years you were working on this topic and then the 1 year that you're working on the book. How did you manage to keep all those plates in the air and to kind of bring it down into this, very tight book? I mean, I know that it was reduced by 35,000 words, but even if it were that much longer, I feel that it would have still been quite a feat to get it all into that package.
Yeah.
How did you do it?
I didn't see my family a lot. It was really, really challenging. I had a whiteboard. I had calendars up on the wall. I had ridiculous things like finish the science reporting by this date. You could do that, like it wasn't an ongoing thing that went on until the last possible minute and then some, right? And then I was fact checking over the summer. It was totally insane. I should say, just on the question of because I'm talking about fact checking, publishing houses don't pay for fact checking for people like me.
Yeah.
And fact checking is very expensive, and I really wanted to get it right, but I also felt like I didn't want to spend the money on a fact checker, but also partly I just didn't see the reason to, because I felt like once I sent all that information to somebody and pointed out where everything was, I might as well just do it myself, right? Like, so when I handed it in May of 2019, and then from May to like through the end of September was a full-time fact checking job. Mm-hmm. Every single line. I tried. I tried. I'm sure my friend Eileen, who we both know, said to me at some point, there's going to be an error in there, and that's okay. That was very hard for me to accept. But it was a monstrous job. So I had getting back to reporting, like I had these like mini deadlines. That was the only way to kind of keep myself sane. I had mini deadlines. And then I started with mini deadlines that were reporting deadlines. And then as I started writing, it collapsed, and it became no longer a thing where I could report and then write. It was like a running, reporting and writing at the same time scenario. And I would just have like finished chapter 12 by this date. And so we have 2 kids, and my husband said, like, you do what you need to do. So my dad has like a house up in the woods about an hour north of where we live. And so what I would do was I would say, I need a week off. And he would say, okay. And I would go up on Sunday night with like a cooler filled with food, and I would fill up the fridge, and I would get up the next morning, and I would work from 8:30 till 11 or midnight. And I would do that Monday through Friday. And then I would come home like on Saturday. And I just, I think I wound up doing that maybe 6 weeks altogether, where I would just and I would work these insane days, and I would finish a chapter that way. and that's how I did it. And it was exhilarating and exhausting. And, I had a brace on my arm that just kept getting worse and worse. And, I had to switch my mouse hand. And there were times when I thought, like, I'm going to finish this book, but I'm not going to be able to type anymore.
Oh God.
You
Is
know,
is your arm any better?
it's pretty bad. Like, it's pretty bad. I brace it. But, if I use it for more than a few hours a day,
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes. I
Yeah.
tried all these like voice typing, like my mom was sending me like voice typing technologies. It just doesn't work for me. So it was a serious challenge.
So, sort of a process question, but I mean, I think that what you did is phenomenal and the result is phenomenal. Would you do this again?
Yes, in a heartbeat. Like, I loved it. I mean, I'm complaining, but like, you know, I don't know. Something about book length felt really good to me. Like, I felt like I could breathe.
Hmm.
After writing so many 2,500 word newspaper articles, and then being excited to stretch with a 6,000 word magazine piece. It's like, oh God, I can stretch out. I can cough. I can go hum. Um, I think it gave me like a little bit of time to kind of meander and think and percolate. And because I was bringing like ethical, sociological, psychological pieces together, then there was something that clicked, and I was able to really think expansively in a way that I think I don't always get the room to. So I would do it again.
Yeah, your book is full of ideas, and one thing that was once said to me by a friend of mine who's a writer she had a gig where she had to write 500 words every week for a news, and she said it took her a while, but she finally realized in 500 words you can only express one idea. And then, I've done like,
Yes.
column type things, and I realized like 750 words, that's an idea and a half, that's it.
Yes.
So, and you get 1,200 words and it's maybe, okay, you get but when you do the research, you do enough research, even for a small article, to kind of feed a book and to be able to really get the ideas out there. I mean, I feel like your book could have been twice or three times as long and I would have kept reading it. Probably Alice couldn't have been stretched out that long,
Right.
but there were so many idea threads to follow. And I just like, we need bionic arms, maybe.
I know. We
Yeah.
need or multiple arms,
Right,
four
right.
arms.
Yeah, extra arms to just handle the physical challenge of doing that, which is kind of funny because you think of this job as being so kind of sedentary and you can do, I mean,
Cerebral.
cerebral. So yes, yes.
Cerebral. And yet it comes down to actually your right wrist.
Hmm. Yes, exactly. Or left, depending on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we're getting towards the end of the hour, and I just want to remind people who are listening, you can order this book from bookshop.org, and the link is in the chat. And I definitely encourage. It's a wonderful book. I actually sort of forced myself to read it in small amounts so I would retain it more, but sometimes I would get to the end of the chapter and I'd see that the next chapter was going to be more about Alice, and I would just think, oh, okay, I'm going to read that part. It really is a page turner, which is amazing for a book that's about science and technology and basically sociological implications.
Thank
Really
you. Yeah.
wonderful job. So I guess like since we just have a few more minutes, are there other things you would say to like the young version of you who's an undergraduate at Penn who wants to become maybe a writer, an investigative journalist, interested in nonfiction, maybe fiction writing? Like what would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say what I sometimes say when I talk to like high school kids who are interested in journalism, which is like everyone's scared, and the person on the other side of the questions is as nervous as you are. And to conjure your sense of entitlement, healthy entitlement, right? Like that's how I get around being a shy person.
Hmm.
Is I think to myself, I'm not asking questions on behalf of myself, because God, I can't ask questions on behalf of myself. It's really hard for me. But I can advocate on behalf of readers. And I think being in newspapers for so long gave me a sense of duty to the readers, so that I felt obligated to ask the difficult things. And then that carried over then to writing a book on behalf of whoever was going to read my book. Um, So that's one thing. And yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I really was extremely on the fence about whether I could make a career as a journalist and as a writer. I thought about going to law school. I thought that that would be like a safer bet.
Hmm.
And it was chance, and it was actually Penn, and it was like a connection that I made at Penn that like led me to this path. Otherwise, I probably would be a lawyer right now, which might have been a fine alternate reality that I can't test to
Yeah.
see if it,
I do remember you became a journalist right out of college. Wasn't
yeah.
it? Just pretty much you were writing for the Washington Post, and
Yeah,
was it like the
I
hope?
had a professor who was a reporter at the Washington Post,
Hmm.
Paul Hendrickson, and
Yeah.
he was teaching a class, and I wrote a profile for the class that he wound up saying, "Can I show this to my boss at the Washington Post?" And I was like, "Sure," and he did, and then they offered me an internship,
Hmm.
and I was all set. I had my plans, and I just sort of threw everything over and said, yes, I'll move to Washington, D.C. And I wound up getting hired and staying there. And so I was there from 98 to 2009. And I was an editor, and at some point toward the end, and I covered politics and things like that. But what I mean, politics is great and blah, blah, in terms of like all that important stuff. But what I think is like the thing that gets me excited is like just real people, like not people that you have to go through a publicist to talk to,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm just so much more interested in those stories. So I guess I would say to myself, like, if that you could follow your natural curiosities, and like that actually like is a legit career.
I think that's a really important message because I think, and especially even more now than when you were an undergrad, a lot of our students have this sense of, heck, I have to have my 5 year plan, I have to have my 10 year plan,
Yeah.
I have to know exactly what I'm going to do. But your career is an example of sort of a combination of following what you really love and are interested in, and just sort of serendipity and being sort of open to things that come to you. I just want to shout out to another member of that class, Eileen Wang, who you
Yes.
mentioned, who is a fantastic writer, and she is also a urologist, a urological surgeon, which is no small achievement. But she loves YA, young adult literature, and she's also a very sort of accomplished young adult writer, but I don't think she published her first book until a few years ago. And I think that's like just like a living example of a wonderful
Yes.
trajectory of someone who loves writing and is open to, just, as it comes, and it came to her. And I hope she's listening, but if not,
Yeah.
maybe she'll
Oh, just as an aside, like Eileen is one of my dearest friends, and I think we met in your class.
probably you were.
And I still remember this wonderful essay she wrote on potatoes. And in my book's acknowledgement sections, you'll see there's like a lengthy paragraph to her because she is the person who encouraged me to write a book, because she's been just effortlessly writing them in addition to her other career as a doctor. And she just kept saying, it's just not that hard. Like you can do it. And as with a lot of things, I tend to hesitate on the edge of the water and dip my toe in. And Eileen is more of a person who just like jumps in and says, okay, once you put your head under, it's not that cold.
Mhm.
And there's room for both styles, but it's definitely really helpful to have a friend who's just like tugs you along and says, you can do this. So I'm incredibly grateful to have Eileen as my friend, and that I met her, at Penn, and I believe in your class, and just to have been in your class was such a pleasure and a privilege.
Yeah, and I feel so I this it's a mutual feeling. I feel like it's an incredible privilege to have had you in the class and Eileen, and to be able to follow your careers.
Thank
And
you.
I guess it's 1 o'clock, so I'm not seeing any notices from Kelly Writer's House that we should stop. But I guess we should say thank you to everyone who joined us, and please read this book. It's it's just such a wonderful read, and it's got a lot of profound questions that you will be thinking about for a long time after you put the book down.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. This was lovely. It's so good to see your face.
Same here. Okay, I'm not really sure if I what we're supposed to do.
Should we
Um,
leave meeting, do you think?